I am so intimidated. I'm intimidated by this little quilt. Can you believe it? You know why? Because I want to put a flange binding on it. And I have been hanging on to this for 2 years now. I need some help. I've called in the big gun. Do you want to meet her? Hi, I'm Di with Sister Chicks Quilting, and welcome to my channel. I promised you'd meet the big gun. Shall I bring her in? She's a little shorter than me, but nonetheless, when it comes to flange binding, Bev is the big gun. For those of you who've been to my retreat, you know Bev Behrens. She makes the bread at my retreat. And boy, is it good. She's also a pro at flange binding, right, Bev?
I'd like to think so, yeah.
She's done quite a few. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And Bev, I brought you in my sewing room because will you teach me how to do a flange binding?
I'd love to. Yeah, that ought to be fun.
Okay, we're going to have some fun. Stick with us. Bev, let's talk about flange binding. For instance, I don't even know when to use flange binding, and you hate to go to all the work to flange bind a quilt because it's a little more work, and then have it be a dud.
And I've had a couple of those duds.
Yeah.
So when I get ready to do a binding, I always think about, will a flange binding actually enhance the quilt? Will it, I look for it to add a pop of color when you have a really busy border and you want to separate the border from the binding if both of them are busy pieces of fabric.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember quilting one of your quilts that way.
Yeah. When you just want a separator between the binding and the border.
Didn't you bring some examples you can show us?
I did bring some examples, and actually some examples of some that worked and one that didn't really work that well. So
the big gun made a goof. Let's take a look at them. Okay.
Well, the first example I brought is an illustration of when you want to pop a color on your quilt.
That is a pretty quilt.
Well, you guys did a great job quilting it for me, too.
Shameless advertising there.
Well, Di has actually quilted all but one of my quilts that I've done in the last few years. And I think we're up to almost 30 now. So,
wow.
So with this one, I just added the little strip of gold. And this was one of my early ventures into doing a flange binding. But I thought that the little strip of gold in here just really set out a pop against that green and against the gray of the binding.
I agree. It looks fantastic. What do you have next for us?
The flange on this actually looks totally different because I used the same fabric for the binding as I did for the border.
That's quite dramatic.
It was one of those things where I wanted to use the same fabric for the binding as I did the border, and a lot of people wonder how that little strip of red got in there because they don't realize that it's the same fabric for the border and the binding. The next one, here, I haven't actually got the binding on yet.
Oh, let me zoom out and see the quilt.
Okay.
That's a pretty quilt. I remember that one coming through.
One of the reasons that you want to do flange binding might be for a separator. Mm-hmm. So if I had this fabric as the binding, it really doesn't work with that border. But if I turn around and put a little pop of color in there and a separator with the flange, it makes this fabric work with this border.
It does. Now, Bev, you don't do every quilt with a flange binding, do you?
Oh, no. There's a lot of them that there's no reason to. It wouldn't add anything to it.
Oh, okay. Well, that one really is quite dramatic, and it picks up the blue over here. So that's the same blue?
It is not the same blue.
Oh my land, you're right, it's not.
I couldn't find any more of the blue that I used in the quilt because oftentimes I bind them quite a ways after the fact, and I don't buy my binding fabric when I make my quilt because I let the finished quilt kind of tell me what the binding ought to be.
Yeah, there she goes again, talking to her quilts.
So it does create some problems sometimes, but
you matched it well.
This one, it's a different reason for using the flange because I wanted to use this green polka dot.
Is there a flange on it at all?
There is. It's a small little gray one here.
Oh.
And it doesn't stand out real well, but the reason I used it on this is because I wanted to bind it in the green polka dot. I didn't have enough fabric for a traditional binding. When you do a flange, your strips are narrower for your binding fabric, and by adding the flange to it, then I had enough fabric to bind the whole quilt.
That is cool. What a great way to stretch your binding.
And so that's a really good tip, that if you have a fabric that you really want to use on your binding and you don't have quite enough, just add a flange to it.
Cool, that's a great idea.
And this
this one is so pretty.
This last example.
Let me zoom out so you can see the quilt. I love this quilt.
She loves the quilt, but the issue with this quilt is that flange binding didn't really add a lot to this. It kind of gets lost in the overall look of the quilt.
It does get lost.
And so I don't think it did anything to actually enhance the quilt. So
Here,
if
I'm
I
gonna
was
zoom in even more.
If I was
there it is. There's that flange binding.
If I was doing this one over again, I probably wouldn't add a flange to it. So
okay.
So those are the examples I brought.
Oh, those are awesome.
There is one more that we'll talk about a little later.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for the little lesson on flange. How, what, why, and where.
Going back to this quilt again, I just wanted to share a couple of things. I think I mentioned earlier that this is one of the first quilts that I did flange binding on. One of the things I really liked about it, I was so nervous about getting my stitching straight, but when I was putting the binding on by machine, that having the flange right here, you stitch in the ditch right there between your binding and your flange, and using your flange thread color. And so it hid my stitches really well. And
so that's stitched in yellow thread.
It is.
And then, but it's not yellow on the back.
No. Well, it is.
It
is on this one. But I always match the thread color on the upper with the color of the flange, and the thread color on the back.
Okay.
Is the color. Your bobbin thread is always the color of your back.
So this one has to be yellow and yellow, but I've seen you do other quilts that are red and white or red and gray.
Yeah, I think this is the only one I have where the flange was the same color as the back.
Oh, that's funny.
Again, you just want to make sure that it adds some enhancement. But for me, the reason I originally started doing flange was because I was nervous about the straight stitch that I would get along my binding as I did it.
And so if you haven't figured it out by now, Bev is a perfectionist and she wants everything to look perfect. I would have just bound the quilt and go, oh dear. She puts out some really good quality work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I'm just kind of wondering, Bev, how do you choose the right flange binding? Because the quilt I showed that I'm having the problem with, actually Blue Block said, oh, you need to do a blue flange binding on that. And I caught her vision. I never even thought of that. Bev, do you have any tips on how to audition and what you're looking for?
Well, I have a design floor, not a design wall, because I have a spot in my family room that I can lay out my quilts. I'll lay the full quilt out. I get different fabrics out there, and I always will just take and fold them like I did earlier for this one and put it up against the quilt and see what I think it looks like. Sometimes I go through a dozen or more iterations of a binding.
That one you matched very well. And what you can see now that I've zoomed in is this border has got a lot of blue in it. So that binding, why don't you lay it over by the border? That is going to be gorgeous.
And I actually bought the binding fabric for another quilt and didn't like it on that at all. And I didn't have anything for this one. And so
and it
just trial and error. It worked out. It just never would have worked without the flange on this one.
Are there any times that a flange won't work?
Well, the one we did earlier when it really didn't enhance the quilt.
Yeah.
And then one last example. With this quilt, I did a scrappy flange.
I'm jonesing on this quilt. You all know if you watched my retreat quilt that I just love this quilt. This is one of my fave quilts that Bev has done. And just a little hint, it's inspired me to do something similar. Tell us why it may not work.
Well, when I got ready to do the flange binding on this quilt, I decided everything else about the quilt was scrappy. So I would do a scrappy flange on this. Up close, that scrappy flange worked. But after I got it done and moved away from the quilt and saw it hanging, some of these, for example, this blue, blends in too much with the border, and it looks like the flange just ends right here on each side.
Yeah, look at that. I zoomed out and the flange kind of disappeared.
Yep.
But boy, that yellow and the white show. And then don't you have a white that looks like it's striped because you've got coloring on it?
Yes. I just used all different kinds of fabrics. Some of these weren't even in the quilt itself. That would be something, if you're going to do a scrappy flange binding, I would definitely recommend that you step farther away than I did and take a look at it, because like I said,
that's a good tip. Look at that piece that totally disappears, and when you zoom into it, oh, there is binding there.
So if you're going to do something like the scrappy flange binding, just lay it on your border fabric and step further away from it.
Okay.
Or hang it up across the room on your design wall and really take a look.
Good idea. Do you cut the flange binding any different from a standard binding, Bev?
Well, to figure the amount of binding that you need, you do it the same way as you would any other binding.
That makes sense.
But you do cut it differently because you're using two different pieces of fabric. And so you determine the width that you want your final binding and go from there. As a standard, I use 1 1/4 inch of my binding fabric and 1 1/2 inch of my flange fabric.
Oh, so the width is not 2 1/2 inches. The width on the standard binding will be 1 1/4 inch, right? And the flange will be
1 1/2.
1 1/2 inches. So you're going to cut 2 strips.
Yeah.
But to figure out how many strips you want, that's exactly the same as you've always done. If when you measure it says you want 7.36 strips, you round up to 8. So that's standard. You brought some examples of how that looks, right, Bev?
I did. So this is a flange that I used on a quilt that I did not bring. The green of being the flange fabric, you want it to fold over and show on the front, and so it is the wider piece of fabric. And this was cut 1 1/2 on the flange and 1 1/4 on the black.
Okay.
This was my very first quilt and the very first one I did flange on.
Notice she didn't bring her very first quilt. You know why?
Actually, it's because it's been given to one of my grandchildren for their wedding. And that's where most of my quilts have gone.
Okay,
is
that's
to my
cool.
grandkids. So
She has a passel of grandkids.
Passel 24.
24.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a passel.
And we have 10 great-grandchildren now, so.
So Bev, I noticed you cut that one a lot wider, and you told me something about you were afraid it might flip up when you washed it or turn over, because where do you stitch? Show with your fingernail where you stitch.
We're going to stitch here in the ditch,
Okay.
and the wider that you leave your flange, the more likely it is to curl, ruffle, flip up. So you don't stitch the edge right along here. You stitch over into here. And so the more fabric you leave out here on your flange, the more likely it is to flip and curl.
Especially every time, our quilts are washable and we wash them and put them in the dryer. And can you imagine the nightmare? Then you're going to have to steam it to get it back in position. And will you ever get it back in position? So
it's not likely you're ever going to get it back the way it started. So with everything we've talked about, you get ready to get started, Di?
Yes!
It's actually easier than you think.
Okay. I'm diving in.
All right, let's
Head
go.
first. Let's go.
All right.
I want to measure this so I know how many strips I need. We're using my phone to record on, so I just want to let y'all know that Bev not only makes incredible rolls, she does math in her head. Quilt math. Oh! I don't know. I struggle with quilt math,
Math
Bev.
was my best subject in school.
That's awesome. We figured out that we need how many strips? 5?
5.
5 strips. This is just a little dinky quilt. I'm going to cut the flange first just because this is kind of new and exciting for me. How much do I need on the flange?
So you're going to cut your flange. It's the wider measurement of the two. So you're going to need your 1 1/2 inch strips.
1 1/2 inch strips.
And you'll need 5.
First I'm going to square up. All right, here I go. We're going to 5 1.5-inch strips coming up.
You know, cutting is one of my favorite parts of making a quilt. I love to cut fabric.
Are you sure only 5? Is that going to be enough?
Based on the measurements you gave me, it should be.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Shall I hold these for you?
Would you
so they're
please?
Out of your way.
Would you please? Do you like the way I just pawned them off on you? Hey, get rid of these. Move these. Bev is not a quilt fairy today. She's my quilt teacher.
And you want these 1 1/4.
Okay. Oh my gosh, that's even smaller. 1 1/4. This is just weird. And this is the main binding.
Yes.
Oh, wow. You really think 5 is going to work?
It should.
It should. I'm going to do another strip just because.
Well, you know, if you have it left over, you can always use it in a scrappy quilt.
And then I'll do an extra one of these.
Well, if you did an extra one of these, you need an extra one of the other.
One of these, you need one of those.
They don't work on their own.
I'm all cut. What's next?
Well, you're going to join all of your binding strips together the same way
Okay.
you would with the bias seam, and then join all of your flange strips together.
Okay, time to sew.
Time to sew.
I'm going to sew these together with a miter corner. In preparation for this video, I was watching several videos that are out there. There was a well-known quilter that was sewing her binding together like this. I was kind of freaked out, but remember, there's no such thing as quilt police. So to each their own.
I think maybe my first binding, I probably sewed it that way too.
My first binding did too.
And you actually do your strips together the same way I do. Have the one straight across on my sewing machine and bring the new one up, and then grab the end of the one I just sewed, put it on there, and add the new one.
I'm going to press just the creases out and the seams open, right?
Yes.
Okay. I am using my Laurastar.
And I notice how flat it's making those folds and stuff.
It is incredible. The Laurastar actually has double steam, Bev. Now this is a funny story. Bev won't use my Laurastar because she says that she knows if she does, she'll buy one. And she doesn't want to spend the money.
I said I'd want one, and
She'd want one.
I can't get one.
Okay, so let me show you. The steam is heated in a boiler and at the head right here. It's double heated steam. And because it's heated twice, what happens is it takes a lot of the moisture out of it. So this iron is absolutely incredible. It's like a dry steam.
Yeah, it was really weird because one of the first things she did was have me hold my hand over there in front of the steam.
Yeah, because see, you can do this. And that is not burning because the steam is dry.
Yeah.
It's the water in the steam that kills it.
I'm trying to figure out how that happens though, because you have it on your hand and it's not burning your hand, but I could feel the heat clear over where I'm standing. It's just kind of amazing.
It's my magic ironing friend. Literally, this has elevated my quilting to a whole new level. My Laurastar is my newest quilting buddy. If I'm in my quilt room all alone, I'll turn on my Laurastar and have a conversation with her and say, do you want to quilt with me? Not really. There's a link in the description below to Laurastar. It goes to a company called Everything Long Arm. I'm an affiliate marketer for them. You can guarantee if you buy a Laurastar, there's a lot of people that sell the Laurastar. They sell theirs lower than anybody else in the United States that's selling Laurastars. So if you want the best deal, You need to get it through everything long arm. And if you're going to go through everything long arm, for heaven's sakes, use my affiliate link because they always throw in extras.
I'm just watching it press those folds, you know.
Isn't that amazing how it works?
And how fast those folds are flat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, look at this. It's the best. Watch. Faster than a speeding bullet.
Yeah.
It's my superhero of irons. Okay, Bev, what's the next step?
You're going to sew those 2 strips together.
Just like this?
You actually do not want to start at the same point because you want your seams to be staggered when you come up to your seams. So I would recommend that you come down a little ways to start your first one. Maybe leave about this much space on it.
Okay.
And that way your seams will be staggered.
Okay, so I'm going to do that and sew this seam together. And what size seam do I use?
Just a regular 1/4 inch.
Okay. I have this all sewn together, Beverly. I know you talked about pressing it, I believe, towards the binding, which the binding is this red and the blue is the flange, correct?
Yes. Some people choose to press their seams open. Some people choose to press it towards the flange fabric. But because of how you fold it, it makes it much more difficult to do it that way. And I've just always found it to be way more successful to press it towards the binding.
All right, and we are pressed, and I believe we're ready to sew, right, Bev?
Nope, you don't sew yet. You've got to fold your binding in half.
Oh, now you fold it in half.
Now you fold it in half, yes.
Got it. I'm folding it with the flange down because you want it all to be the same size. You really don't want a wavy flange.
Yeah, and that's usually how I do with the open edges away from me.
Uh-huh. Okay. See how nice that's looking? That's going to be a cool flange. This is a funny story. So Bev does this quilt. She's the one that inspired me to do the Pineapple Blossom quilt by Bonnie Hunter. She made this beautiful pineapple blossom quilt out of all this plaid fabric. It was gorgeous. She wanted to put it in a quilt show. She was kind of at a deadline, and she put this black and white striped binding on it, which black and white stripe is some of my favorite bindings. But you know, you've got to have the right quilt to put it on. Anyway, Bev was just really unhappy with it. And she ended up picking it off and rebinding. And the new binding was absolutely beautiful. So binding does matter.
It really was bad. I looked at it and said, what was I thinking? But you're right, I had a deadline and nothing else seemed to work, and everybody talked about using stripes on binding, and I thought, okay, I'll do this. Nope. You know, when I picked it off, then I just took all the little pieces of plaid that I had left over from the quilt.
And the scrappy plaid binding was gorgeous.
It worked so well. I don't know why I didn't think about doing that to start with.
And I am done ironing. Now I'm told I get to sew it on the quilt. So Beverly, when I sew a normal binding on, I put about 9 inches extra for a tail on both sides for a connection. Do you do the same on a flange binding?
Pretty much just the same.
The same, but
since you're a beginner at the flange binding, you might start with 1 inch or 2 more.
Okay, I'll start with 1 inch or 2 more. Or 2. She's laughing. This is the part.
I love the way you measure things like that.
I'm a little nervous, guys.
You got this.
Well, I know. It's just I'm still a little nervous. And I sew it on at where I normally sew my binding on,
You're
right?
just going to sew it on like a regular binding that you
Okay.
attach by machine.
All right, here I go. Hey, you know my binding hack? Am I able to do that with this, where I sew the little extra bit?
I haven't tried that on a flange binding, so now would be a good time to try that.
Okay.
Yeah, since you put out that video on that, I haven't actually put binding on a quilt. I've been busy making tops
You
and
haven't?
not binding them.
I have done like eight bound quilts since that video, and each time I do, I am so amazed that I just get super excited about it.
You got to make sure there's a link to that video down in the description area.
Okay, I'll do that. We will do that. She's watched my videos before, can you tell?
Yeah, it's my company in my sewing room while I'm sewing. I have a little TV on the end of my
I
sewing
hang-
table, and I put on
Nice.
quilting videos.
I hang out with a lot of quilters via YouTube.
And I usually let them run in the background, and every once in a while something piques my interest, and it's like, oh, I got to stop and watch this.
So I'm mitering off the corner.
So you're going to do that where you leave just a little
I
bit
am.
extra.
What I do is I flip it back, and I finger press this, and then I fold it forward
Now you had,
the way we normally do. But what I've done is I've got my little extra bit right here. And if I want to see how much I put down, I'll flip it over. See that little bit? The little blue bit right here that's over?
so is that about the right amount?
Yep. And
Okay.
there's a lot of this in it, so you really can't see very well because of all the threads. For crying out loud. I'm holding this with my finger, going to start back at 1/4 inch. And it's all sewn down. And this is going to go really fast because
It's a pretty small quilt.
yeah. And is it looking right here? What did Beverly tell me? That I had enough? And then I said, oh, I'm going to throw one more strip on just in case. Well, here's my just in case. It was so big it knotted. Oh my gosh. Down here?
Yeah.
Okay. All I have to say is trust the force, Luke. What do I do now?
Okay, normally you would fit these together. In the case of flange binding, you actually want to separate your two sections.
Okay.
And that is because it will make a much neater flange, and you'll understand that when we're done with it. I've tried doing it without separating them, and it just has never worked for me.
All right. Do I keep going? You'll tell me when to stop, I assume.
Well, I won't let you go the whole quilt.
I hope not.
What you're going to do now is you're going to treat each strip like it was a binding
Okay.
on another quilt and come down and figure out your angle. But you want those to be in different places. You dropped your...
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Do you know how sharp these are, Bev?
Yeah.
Oh, you've been... My girlfriend Marie had her stiletto open, and she set it down and it rolled off the table and right in the top of her foot. I know.
Okay, so you can start with your red one and act like it is act like it's the same as your other binding.
Got it.
Because you want to sew on the diagonal.
Okay.
So
okay.
you're going to cut it just like
Okay.
you would your other binding.
I can figure this out. I'm a big girl.
So just get your length like you would on a regular binding.
Okay, I'm cutting this here. And then on this one, does everybody know what I'm doing? I cut a width of my binding. I'm using it to measure my width of the length of my binding. And then I put these aside and do it with the blue.
And do it with blue. The thing is, you want your blue to be in a different spot so that your seams aren't exactly together.
That makes sense.
maybe
So
your blue
I'll
is
go up here a little
further
bit.
up. Well, that color blends in really well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So then you're just going to join this piece like you would a regular binding.
Uh-huh.
You're going to have
On the bias. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pin this together.
yes to take out
So-
some of that.
Yeah, so
tension
it's
on it.
easy. So we're going to start with the red, right?
Yes. Or
And
blue. It doesn't matter. You're just going to start with one of them
I'm going to put these together like this.
and just sew on your diagonal, and then you'll do the same on the blue.
So far, this isn't too difficult. I don't know how it looks up there, guys. It always helps to have thread in the machine.
That's one of my biggest pet peeves about sewing is I have been chain piecing blocks, and I'll get 30 down the row and find out that I have 27 of them that aren't connected together because
I
I
know.
ran out of bobbin thread.
And I am committing the ultimate evil sin, everyone. Do you see what it was? I just ran over 2 pins. I figured I was going slow enough that I could handle it. All right, I'm going to pull the pins out, and here's the test. Look at that, they're joined. Okay.
So then you'll do the next one in the same way.
Okay, where the bulk. When I did this before on a binding, pin the seam back or the bulk back like that, people were amazed. They said, I didn't know you could do that. And I'm like, yep, you can do anything you want to.
Oh, it makes it so much easier.
So,
exactly the same way.
so this to this.
Uh-huh.
This one is a little easier. So I am going to not pin it because it's so small you can do that. Get away with not pinning it.
Up. Success on one, not on the other.
See the twisty twist? That was a pretzel binding. Okay. Okay.
And that's one of the reasons I usually go ahead and leave a little bit of extra,
Uh-huh.
more than a regular quilt.
Not a whole length extra. Like I did.
No, but I mean, when I'm deciding how far down to begin or end,
Uh-huh.
a couple of inches extra.
And it's done.
Okay, so once you're sure you've got them, then you're going to trim off your triangles in the back, your extra
Okay.
in the back. So when you stretch them out, they should pop into place there.
And they do.
So then you're just going to take and sew
Then back together.
them back together. Yes.
Okay.
And then you'll just stitch it down. So you had a lot of space on this end, so
And not
maybe
much on
next
this
time you
one.
would bring one of them a little bit further down because your seams still ended up pretty close together. So
It did.
you might bring one of them further down this way.
Okay. Well, I have room now. That did it. I think I'm going to pin it just because it
To get
is
started
awkward
for sure.
and it's going to hold it for me.
I
These
just
to
finger
go.
press those open.
Do you have one of these, Bev?
No, I don't.
Oh, they're so nice. Look at that finger press.
So then you just sew your 2 pieces back together on the original seam that you picked out. And I suppose if you were really good at figuring out your distances, you could just leave that much of a gap not sewn together at the beginning, and then you'd only have to pick out one seam on one end.
Okay, here I go.
So next time I would recommend maybe not picking out quite so far down,
Okay.
so close to where you began your stitching.
Yeah, I did, didn't I?
Just leave a little bit more space between where your stitching begins and where you pick out too. And then this part, the part of sewing it back together isn't quite so complicated.
Well, you
And it's
know,
really not complicated. It's just,
well, I had to make mine complicated. I will make a flange binding again
well,
because they look really, really cool.
and the second time you
And-
do it is easier than first, and the third time you
Right.
do it is easier than the second.
Right.
You know, and then pretty soon it's just like you got it down. Then it's just going to pop back into place. You can just take it.
I'm going to finger press
Yeah,
again.
you can either pop up to the iron or you can just take and roll it down with your roller.
Well, that was kind of painless. A little fussy,
Well, first time,
but yeah.
and pop it back on there.
Okay. Ooh, this is kind of exciting because I can see some light at the end of the tunnel. Here I'm finishing sewing the flange to the back of the quilt. You always sew a flange binding with the facing down. Said that on purpose. Orientation is important here. I should have said the front facing down, because you're going to flip it over and you want that front piece on top, like so. I flipped the quilt over to the top to stitch down the binding. I didn't press it. I have never been a presser of binding. I know some of you do, and it's purely optional, but I'm just not one of those optional people. I'm stitching in the ditch here, right between the seam on the binding and the flange, and it's fairly easy to follow that line. I notice that you can probably see me pinching the top edge of the quilt with the binding as I pull it through the machine. I'm not really pulling it through the machine. For some reason, it's a habit I've developed, and I don't pull it through. I let the machine pull it through. I just have to do something with my hand. I love the way this flange is looking, and here I want to test it, and I think it looks like a tiny little piece of piping. I'm so grateful to learn this process. I'm coming up on a corner and I'll talk you through it. The first thing I do is fold the bottom binding up and put a couple of wonder clips in it to hold it. Then, using the stiletto to get a crisp fold on the corner, I fold it over and I hold it exactly in place with the stiletto while I sew the rest of the binding down. I stop the needle right on the corner, and then I lift the presser foot, pivot, and begin sewing. The stiletto holds everything better than a wonder clip or my fingers or a pin, and I'm pretty addicted to using it. The extra little fold of binding in my binding hack makes these corners so easy. I know I'm harping on it, but it's just amazing me. Every time I use it, it gets easier and easier, and my corners look better and better. Will you look at that corner? I am really liking the faux flange binding and that binding hack. If you haven't watched my video on my binding hack where you add extra fabric in the fold, you've got to, because it is just wowza. I asked Bev how her week was, what she had been working on, and she brought this to show and tell. Like, oh, can you believe it?
You know, it was a quick and very quick and easy project, and I had a lot of fun with it. So
Quick and easy. Can you hear that?
quick and easy.
I have to tell you something. Bev was the queen of the patterns, and she was making all of these patterned quilts forever. And she saw one video that I did that was scrappy. I believe it was the one that I made for Aunt Connie. Oh, no. It was
the string.
The string quilt that I did at Christmas, right?
Yep.
The Christmas string quilt that has Santa Claus on the back. And that video turned Bev into a scrappy monster. So why don't you tell us about it, Bev?
So I actually cut and sewed the top in just about a week. It's a basic 4-patch. It's so easy. And the blocks, each 4-patch block just has a little rectangle on the end of it. The only thing that I did that was planned on this was I made the 4-patch blocks kind of cohesive. So purple print with a darker purple, orangish print with an orange.
I can see a yellow and a brown, a red and a tan, a green and a light green.
Yep. Sewed the 4 patches together. Put a rectangle on each of the 4 patches, and it's a white on white, so there is a little bit of pattern to it.
I can see that.
And then they got sewed together in a row.
So that's a row. Show us the row below that one.
This row then is basically a sashing row. It has one of those same rectangles and a square, rectangle and a square, and those get sewed together.
And of course you cut the rectangles at 4.5 inches, right?
Yes, and I cut the rectangles at 2 by 4.5.
2.5 by 4.5?
2.
Oh, 2.
Start with 2. So they finished at 1.5 inches.
Oh, so everything is 2 inches.
Everything is 2 inches, and that measurement came up because I had a tote with a whole bunch of 2-inch strips in it.
There you go.
That's why they're 2 inches.
Now, and point out the sashing row again.
The sashing row is just like square, rectangle, all the way down.
Wow. And then a row of 4 patches. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Tell us about the border.
This was set together with, because it's on point, it was set together with setting triangles. But before you could put the setting triangles on, you actually had to sew a row of the sashing and a row of the blocks together. And then your setting triangle was to hook both of those together instead of
I can see that. What is your advice on setting triangles? Because I've always struggled with them.
I always cut them larger than the pattern says, but I always cut them a little larger and trim them down after I have them sewed on.
That's smart. I think that's a good quilting practice. The first time I did setting triangles, I did them the exact size that I needed, and it was a nightmare. And when I ended up putting my binding on, I have my points cut off. And I'm not going to tell you which quilt that's on, but one of these days you'll see me wrapped up in a quilt or looking at one of my quilts, and you'll go, oh, that's the quilt. She cut the points off on the whole border. Speaking of borders, I see is that like a French braid?
It is a French braid border.
Oh, wow.
And I just used a center square and then did the braid out from both sides. I just sewed the strips on, and when I got done to the width that I wanted.
Oh, and this is amazing. Look at the top corner.
You're going to make me jump to get there.
Oh, you're too short.
I am short. But the braids just came and fit together, and then I added a little corner triangle on there and put the outside border on it.
That is amazing.
And the really bad thing about this is I used all of these 2-inch strips to make this quilt, and I still have a full box of 2-inch strips, so I don't know why they didn't reduce. But
so that's because it's the nature of it.
It is the nature of beast.
Okay.
I fell in love with this quilt.
If I wanted to make this, let's go over the squares. There was no pattern. We're not reading notes. She did this like on the fly, you guys. This is a serious on the fly quilt. So this wasn't totally on the fly. Bev saw it in a magazine from 1980. Let's talk about the measurement. I have been saving retro fabric from the 50s and 60s. I have 2.5-inch squares, and I have to thank you for them, Bev, because I got a bunch of them from her mother-in-law when her mother-in-law passed away. I want to do this quilt. This is marvelous, and I think this is what I'm going to do with mine. However, I know I won't have enough to do the border. Your border is stunning with the French braid. I'm going to have to come up with another solution for the border. I think mine is going to have to be a binding rather than a border. Yeah. But I'll do everything up to the border and then do a really nice binding.
I actually started with 2-inch squares.
Oh, with 2-inch squares.
So they turned out 3 by 3, and the little rectangles were 2 by 3.5. And I got the measurement on the rectangles wrong earlier because I was thinking about your larger quilt. So yeah, you're wanting to do it with 2.5-inch squares?
Yeah, it'll be bigger, and it won't be as cool looking, will it?
Oh, I think it'll still look really good. You would just use 2.5-inch squares, and then it would finish at a 4-inch block
rather than a.
And then you would cut this 2.5 by 4.5 then. Okay,
I guess I could. Yeah, I've cut them at 2.5 inch. I could cut them down again, but I don't know if I have the guts to throw away that much retro fabric.
Just do them. It'll be gorgeous no matter what you do.
Yeah.
And I have so many 1.5-inch strips. I'm thinking about doing a version of this in 1.5. That'll finish to 1 inch then.
Oh, that would be beautiful. That would be like total postage stamp size. Yeah. So, bottom line, I wanted to show you what Bev has been up to this week. Now, let me show you what I have been up to this week with Bev. She told me I didn't need the extra strip. She was right. There it is. But this is our quilt.
Her quilt.
My quilt.
Ta-da! Got the right side up?
Did I? Yeah.
Yeah. First time.
Well, no, I looked and I saw that the little people were up because I sewed it so everybody was facing up. So anyway, what do you think of my first flange binding? I've got some clips on it because I want to show you some corners that I did. Okay, I wanted to show you my corners. The binding hack worked marvelous on this. What do you think of that corner? And then on the back side, everybody wants to know what the back side looks like when I bind a quilt. This is what it looks like. Can you see the threads in there? I do have threads on the back. Some of them are in the ditch, and sometimes they went over on the back of the binding. You know what, you guys? I'm just okay with it. I'm totally okay with it. Most people don't look at the back of a quilt. Here's another corner. Okay, look at this one. And again, this is the binding hack, and I'm gonna flip it down. Can you see that corner? Isn't that amazing? It is just so easy to use that binding hack. And then I combined it with a flange binding, and I'm like, I can't believe I did this. I am going to do flange bindings again. I had a lot of fun learning how to do this flange binding, and I hope you did too. This is definitely a ta-da moment. Some of you said you really liked my ta-da moments, so ta-da.
And you know, it'll get easier the second one that you make and easier the third one, and then it'll just be, you know.
It will. Thanks for the encouragement, because that is true. The more you practice, the better you get. I want to thank Bev Behrens for coming to my house, into my sewing room, and teaching me a flange binding today. I thought it was well worth my time. Bev, thank you so much.
You're welcome, and I want to thank you for inviting me.
Oh yeah, we had so much fun. Thank you for watching my video, and if you like what you see, I would love it if you would subscribe. If you don't subscribe, I'm never going to get to that silver play button. So I guess there's no other nice way to say, come on, please subscribe, you guys.
Well, look where it got me.
Yeah, that's right. We'll see you next week with another video about quilting. Bye.
Bye.